Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our November session of Project ECHO. We are grateful to our case presenter today and to our subject matter experts to walk us through one of those areas that we don't think about, but then we have to address when it comes right before us, and that is disaster planning or emergency preparedness in hospice care. We have Brian Manuel here who will walk us through an experience that their organization faced, and we're looking forward to an engaging conversation around what happens when emergency strikes, whether it's man-made, whether it's natural emergency, how prepared do we feel, and what are the benefits of preparing in advance, and what kind of preparation would that look like? This session will last for about an hour, and we'll walk through a little bit of a didactic, and then we'll hand it over to Brian to walk us through the experience that his organization had faced. As we start this session, I would ask you to please utilize the chat and get to know each other. Put your name, where you're from, and what your role is in your organization. And it'd be great to get to know everybody. As we continue this session, please feel free to add your comments, add any questions in the chat. Karuna, I think we are ready to share the screen. Thank you. Okay, so I believe we'll be looking at that PowerPoint shortly. I do see Karuna, it says started screen sharing. I don't see the screen just yet, but I can go ahead in the interest of time and start talking about what we'll be talking about today. We have a case presentation. Here we go. We've got the screen. Sage Oak Assisted Living and Memory Care. And on our next slide, we'll be looking at our disclosures. Very quickly, the planners and faculty disclose they have no financial relationships with any commercial interest. There is a data collection element here. So in order to support the growth of the ECHO movement, Project ECHO collects participation data for each ECHO program. The data allows Project ECHO to measure, analyze, and report on the movement's reach. Data is used in reports, on maps and visualizations, for research, for communications and surveys, for data quality assurance activities, and for decision-making related to new initiatives. Thank you for being here and for being a part of the Project ECHO movement. Evaluation, you will be receiving an email with a link to complete a short survey about this session. Please complete the survey within 48 hours. Completion of this evaluation is required for Quality Connections credit. So for those participants, attendees, organizations that are also a part of the NHPCO Quality Connections program, whether you're a subject matter expert, whether you're a case presenter or an attendee, participating in this session will also offer you credit towards that program. And if you're not a part of the program, we'd love to share the program with you. We ask all participants to take the survey as it will help us to improve future clinic sessions. This is the last Project ECHO session of the year. And towards the end, we'll be sharing about plans about the 2023 NHPCO Project ECHO. Today's agenda, we start with welcome and brief introductions. We will be introducing case presenter and our subject matter experts. Brief didactic about emergency preparedness, relevant resources, the why, the what, and the how. Why are we even having this conversation? Case presenter will present details and specific questions, and we'll definitely have some insights and some ponderings, questions and clarifications from the participants, and final thoughts from subject matter experts and from the participants. Ground rules. This is an all share, all learn format. You may have heard Project ECHO, all teach, all learn format. So of course, no judging, respecting one another, disagreeing, but doing so respectfully. One person speaks at a time, use video whenever possible. Of course, if your internet connection will not allow, feel free to keep camera optional, but it's great to make eye contact with camera. We simulate in-person experience as best as we can. Remain on mute unless speaking. And here, the case study is de-identified. We do not disclose any protected health information or any personally identifiable information. All right, so before we go ahead, would love to turn it over to our session presenter, Brian. I know Cindy was not able to make it today. And then after Brian, would love to turn it over to our subject matter experts for introductions.
Yeah, so I'm Brian Manuel. I'm currently the executive director for Sage Oak Assisted Living and Memory Care. But at the time of this particular incident, I was the senior administrator for Heart of Hospice, which is now part of the LHC group. And so we're going to kind of go through our experience as it relates to that particular event. A couple of things I want to point out before we get into the presentation. First off is, unfortunately, I've experienced this 3 separate occasions in my life, this particular event. And so it wasn't necessarily anything unique to us, but it was definitely a very challenging thing. And the second thing is, and I didn't mention it in the slides, but some of the unintended results of us being in the middle of COVID during this event really helped us prepare for how to do healthcare differently and to make sure that our patients' needs were met during this time with the use of things like televisits and such. So those 2 things I just want to kind of keep in mind as we kind of walk through the slides. So,
thank you, Brian. I'll hand it over to Dr. Eric Bush for introductions.
Thanks, Aparna. So Eric Bush, Chief Medical Officer with Hospice Chesapeake Supportive Care. We are in mid-Maryland, and I've been in that role for 6+ years. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you. Shannon?
Hi, I'm Shannon Cooper. I'm the Director of Quality and Education for Treasure Coast Hospice, which is located in Southeast Florida. My background is nursing and public health. Nice to meet everybody.
Thanks for being here, Shannon. We have Leslie Foster next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Foster. I am currently the Bereavement and Volunteer Manager here at Vitas Healthcare, located in Houston, Texas. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, Leslie. Leslie Connor.
Hi, I'm Leslie Connor. I work with House Call Providers Hospice in Portland, Oregon, and I am a social worker by trade, and I am the compliance specialist for House Call Providers.
Thanks for being here, Leslie. All right, so let's dive into the presentation, the didactic portion of why are we having this conversation? What is emergency preparedness? And more than what emergency preparedness is, what is the purpose of it? So the purpose of disaster planning is to establish procedures, policies, and protocols at every level, at starting at the federal level, state, local, community, even tribal levels, as tangible, as close to persons and communities as we can get, to navigate unpredictable events and provide guidelines for appropriate allocation of resources and continuity of care and necessary activities. We often think about emergency preparedness from a healthcare perspective, but there's so much more to that. Being in healthcare and from a provider perspective, we often get laser focused on treatment and care plans and ensuring we're, getting at the right outcomes. When it comes to management of emergency, that's where our skills around integration, collaboration, and communication come into place. And really our planning. How robust have we done our planning? Planning guides can be a vital resource to providers and to the whole community in systemically thinking through the start to end of a potential crisis. The more systematically we can think about the full process, the more we're prepared. Especially estimating the required capabilities during an emergency. The capabilities that we have available in a non-emergency and everyday situation are so much different than the capabilities that are required during an emergency. We have to think faster. We have to think, in a more streamlined manner. And we have to, I think, Brian, you mentioned that we have to think differently. Of course, 2 years of COVID, 2 or more years of COVID have taught us to think differently. And we've definitely accelerated some of the innovations that would have taken a longer time. But during an emergency, we need much more than being innovative. The planning guide also provides a framework for shifting roles and responsibilities and providing an intentional and thoughtful way for how leaders and those involved in emergency response will respond and lead through the crisis. We often put the responsibility to leadership. At the same time, it's really important for every single member of our team, every single member of our community to be prepared and for us to be able to think through when the emergency does happen. A shared planning or a shared community plan is vital. And general planning and preparedness resources are available at the FEMA website. So you'll find in this PowerPoint, there's many resources available. And like we said, resources at different levels, planning, policies, and protocols at different levels are necessary. So as we move from the federal to the CMS guidance, from the FEMA standpoint to CMS guidance, we then put the lens of quality, safety, and oversight. The CMS guidance from that quality, safety, and oversight group enables governmental agencies at all levels, as well as healthcare providers, to respond to any emergency in a timely, integrated, and organized manner. You'll see, the resources and link down on the right bottom. There's many more resources available. This oversight group utilizes an all hazards approach for disruptive events. So it's not like one hazard is deeper than another, but really from a broad-based umbrella sort of a perspective, any kind of event that is disruptive. We have some examples here. This is not an all-inclusive list. There may be many others. Man-made, natural, and somewhere in between as well. And this oversight group provides some resources that will enhance our ability to respond in a systematic and design-based manner. So let's shift gears and let's think about hospice regulations. What do the conditions of participation say? The conditions of participation are much more detailed, and this one slide probably does not do justice to the full details of what is required under regulations, but we've sort of provided an outline here. The hospice must comply with all applicable federal, state, and local emergency preparedness requirements. The hospice must establish and maintain an emergency preparedness program that meets the requirements of the section. The plan also must be reviewed every 2 years or so. The emergency preparedness program must include at least the following elements. There may be more elements, but it must include an emergency plan, a clearly outlined emergency plan, policies and procedures, a communication plan, training and testing, and how will you integrate with healthcare systems, with different kinds of healthcare systems. And there's also an outline for how will you integrate with community resources as well. There are some NHPCO resources as well. You'll find as we look across the bow of hospice and palliative care resources, there are many guidelines, many toolkits that are available. These are some toolkits that are readily available on the NHPCO website, very comprehensive. Of course, beyond these toolkits and guidelines, there are many more resources, but as and if you're thinking about putting a toolkit together, putting a systematic plan together, consider some of these resources. The Emergency Preparedness Toolkit for Hospice Providers. It includes understanding of the disaster response system, action steps for compliance, policies and procedures, cultural competency considerations, and communication plan. From a diversity, equity, inclusion, and access perspective, we understand that cultural competency considerations are important to be able to provide comprehensive care at the point of when it's most vital. Secondly, the crisis standards of care in hospice and palliative care emergency management provides a framework for catastrophic disaster response and an overview of considerations for ethical allocation of resources during an emergency. That's where we think about the utilitarian framework. That's where we think about, and we saw that during COVID, during the COVID surges, that how do the allocation of resources happen? Just like any other ethics situation, it's very gray, very nebulous, and does require a lot of thoughtfulness and integration of many different team members and stakeholders. The State Operations Manual, Emergency Preparedness for Hospice Providers and Hospice-Related Interpretive Guidance, as well as the Hospice Emergency Preparedness Conditions of Participation Compliance Checklist with survey guidelines as well. So these are all the resources at your fingertips available for you on the website, in addition to much more that's available from CMS, FEMA, HHS, and others. So let's get back to how emergency is not an everyday event. And because it's not an everyday event, we might lose sight of it. We might forget to, beyond the preparedness exercises that we do in our community, we may or may not remember to dust off our manuals, protocols, and refresh training and capabilities for our staff as well. We know that emergency situations are unpredictable. They do not come with a warning. Healthcare providers, vital services, community resource, and governmental agencies, they must continue to function through emergency and non-emergency times. And the expectation is that we are receiving the same level of services. That's sort of the expectations that we have. Human needs and care requirements do not change. Especially for the ill and vulnerable sections of community, these requirements are heightened often during an emergency. During an emergency, mitigation and response are key, but so are preparedness and recovery. So oftentimes we think about being prepared, we think about mitigating, we think about responding, taking care, but then afterwards, the debrief and the recovery piece are just as important. With that, we move to today's case themes. We will hear from Brian, the unfolding of an emergency, vital focus on communication, integration, and coordination of resources, and much more. Role of community agencies and networks. Navigating capabilities. We talked about how the capabilities are not the same, and the demands that are put upon those capabilities and resources are not the same in emergency and non-emergency times. And the role of the interdisciplinary team, really all disciplines, all hands on deck. And we're also looking forward to hearing about lessons learned. And with that, I will turn it over, Brian, to you.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank y'all for allowing us to present this case. It was definitely a very challenging time in our agency's life. And like I mentioned before, the fact that COVID was a factor during this added some additional layers of preparedness that we had to make. So we'll go ahead and get started with this slide. And I'm just going to go to the next slide. A couple of things, obviously with the great thing about hurricanes is at least we do have some sense of a warning, usually at least a week out, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the track. For us, throughout hurricane season, we're always kind of in heightened awareness mode, and we've kind of lived through enough hurricanes in our lifetime to, not to look at one as not as dangerous as the other, but obviously the attendant effects that happened with this particular one made a special impact on us. The other thing I'll mention is that the events that we're going to talk about, one of the things I didn't mention in the slide was Hurricane Laura hit August 25th. On October the 9th, Hurricane Delta hit us again. So we had two hurricanes back to back. So a lot of the work and preparation we had done for the first hurricane really helped us prepare for a second hit, and which obviously is not a common thing to happen, but we were able to build on that experience to make sure that our patients were taken care of. So obviously became a Category 5 hurricane very quickly. At the time we had a 220 patient census and 91 employees. One of the things that we often forget about in preparation is we always have this plan in mind. But at the end of the day, the unknown is how will it affect our staff? Will they have resources? Will they have the ability to respond? As much preparation as you can make, you just don't know what the next steps were going to be. So really, we had began about 2 weeks out, and you can go into the next slide, preparing for what was to come. That was, as far as the teamwork goes, not only the local agency, but also our corporate office begin to have daily conversations to really talk about, let's forecast worst case scenario. Now for us, the worst case scenario, what ended up happening was even worse than what we had anticipated. But at the same time, there were a lot of things that were discussed prior to that really helped us to be better prepared to respond. Obviously the first thing is the mock drills that we do throughout the year for an emergency. Making sure that employees are engaged, they're aware, they have the appropriate training, they know how to communicate those things to our patients and their families. And really trying to do our best to prepare the family of what could happen and making sure that they're fully aware of that. Also, making sure that we have up-to-date, correct contact information. We all know in the hospice industry, sometimes the person who's there when we first sign a patient up on hospice isn't always the person who maybe provides their care on the weekends. It's not the person who they were going to evacuate to with. It's the person they're going to go to. And so there was a lot of fact finding that had to be done prior to, making sure that we understood, did they have the resources to evacuate? If so, where were they going to go? Who were they going to stay with? How long could they stay there? Do they have the financial resources to remain there? If they were going to go there, were there resources available for them to continue on to have care? In the past, most of our, if you will, hurricane experiences, apart from Hurricane Rita and Katrina in 2005, most of it was being gone for a week or so, reestablishing, resources like power and food and that sort of thing, and residents being able to return home. And so most of our preparation at this point was really looking at it not necessarily in a large scale, long-term problem, but looking more so in the short term. And so one of the things you're going to hear me talk about as we kind of go through the slides is no one really knew how much we would be affected and to what length that effect would last. And so, which obviously has changed the way we prepare for disasters moving forward. Attending meetings with our Office of Emergency Preparedness, really talking with everything from hospitals to ambulance services, understanding what their thinking is. When an emergency happened, everybody just assumes that everything's going to happen as it was intended to happen, and there's always something that happens. For us, EMS at that point in time, when an emergency comes, they're doing a lot of transferring patients out of hospitals and other things. And so a lot of emergency services that are traditionally available and a part of the emergency process, all their resources are drained. And so as a result of it, not only are we talking about, hey, listen, what is your place in this role, but also what happens if you're not available. And so we're having to bring additional resources in. The next thing is obviously being prepared, in an emergency for your power to go out. Doesn't matter whether it's a snowstorm or whether it's a hurricane or tornado. Obviously, the beautiful thing about electronic medical records is they're accessible from anywhere, but when you need them and you need them on hand and you don't have things like power internet service. So we spent a lot of time making sure not only the management team, but also the individual nurses and staff had copies of face sheets, MARs, those types of things in order to help triage the situation and to make sure we had it all available. The other thing was meeting with our DME pharmacies, those types of things, really preparing our patients, making sure they had medications on hand. We actually met with our DME company and said, hey, what's going to be your response plan? And because they particularly did not have a well-prepared response plan, we actually ordered a significant supply of oxygen concentrators, e-tanks, those types of things to make sure that if they weren't prepared to respond to the crisis, we at least had enough resources on hand in order for us to prepare to respond as well. So you can go to the next slide. Coordinating with nursing homes, in a perfect world, they have a sister facility to go to. One of the things that we encountered, because we have a few nursing homes that are not part of a larger network, is there was a lot of uncertainty. Their owners and their operators were spending a lot of time trying to find placement for the residents, which meant, we probably at that time had about 40 patients that were involved in a long-term skilled facility. And there was a big question mark. Where were they going to land? How long was it going to take them? What happened if something happened along the way? And so really, again, being a part of their conversations, making sure that there was coordination going on. Obviously at this point now we're getting employee cell phone numbers. We're talking to the administrator. We're calling the facilities the patient's going to ahead of time, making sure that we have all the contact information needed. And then daily meetings, for us, preparing for it, we know how important communication is. And so everything changes minute to minute. And so we were having meetings every day, sometimes twice a day, to make sure not only was the corporate office informed of what was going on, but also each of the local individual agencies. We had to establish communication lines for the employees. Hey, listen, when the power goes out and cell phones goes out, how are we going to talk? Because at the end of the day, if you're in the affected area and we're unable to talk and we're unable to communicate, how are we going to take care of our patients if we can't communicate ourselves? And so we had to establish some different places to that. And then roles and responsibilities. Many times positions like chaplains, the bereavement coordinator, volunteer coordinator, they really don't know where they fit in the process. Sometimes they go through the training and they're like, hey, listen, but when this happens, I'm not going to have any volunteers. What's my place? And so we had to spend a tremendous amount of time, divvying out responsibilities. This is going to be, you're going to help take care of the staff. And so every day you're going to communicate with them. You're going to help take care of our residents and their families, and you're going to communicate. And so making sure that everybody understands the importance that this is a team effort. One of the things that most hospice teams, if you will, especially those in an affected area, I'm going to say emotionally struggle with, is because obviously their personal lives are being impacted. And so there's some emotional strain on them going like, hey, how are you going to expect me to provide care for our patients when I have needs myself? And so, the great thing about having just good qualified social workers is to help work through those things. In healthcare, when emergencies happen, we're the one that runs towards the emergency, not away from it. And so really had to do some coaching along the way to make sure that everybody was kind of in the right mindset and had an understanding of the importance of their role, but also making sure that they understood that we understood that they would have needs as well that would have to be addressed. And so part of our coordination prior to was making sure that maybe some resources would be available for them and be able to work through some of those things. And then the next thing is for hospices that are part of larger organizations. At that time, we had 16 agencies spread across 3 states. And so we were beginning to make plans. Hey, listen, if all of our systems go down, how are you going to support us? Everything from rolling our phones over to doing some different things like that. So you can go to the next slide. The hard facts about it. So, Hurricane Laura hits. I was actually staying an hour away because they had the police, the fire department, and everybody literally left town. All of our emergency responders, they were concerned that due to the gravity of the situation, that if anything detrimental were to happen to them, there would be no one to respond to the emergency. And so about 3 hours beforehand, the statement was made, the police moved out, the fire department moved out, everybody moved out of town. And so I left out of town, I was about an hour away. And again, watching it happen on television, I drove back in. And I lived through Hurricane Katrina and Rita, so I know what it's like to have a very large scale hurricane affect an area, but just seeing the level of devastation that happened, our entire infrastructure, it was the largest destruction of an electrical infrastructure that had ever happened in the history of all power companies across the entire United States. Literally every power pole was down, every distribution line that feeds power into the community was gone. Literally it was gone. The water treatment plant stopped, cell phone communication was crippled, and all of these emergency systems that were put in place to help lessen the blow, many of those systems failed as well. So it's one thing when you don't have power, but believe it or not, what's more important to that is water. And for sanitation, obviously it's during the summer months, it's very hot here in Louisiana, and having no power and then having no water created a very difficult situation, not only for our team, but also our community at large. We didn't know how many employees, their homes were going to be messed up, what resources that were available to them. If an employee could come home, what were they going to come home to? Were they going to have a bed to sleep in? Were they going to have, what are they going to do with their children during this time if they're a single parent, those types of things. Every one of our long-term care homes were uninhabitable. Not a single one of them survived the hurricane. All the roofs were gone. They were either flooded, just very, very, very disheartening. And then all the roads were impassable. Not only were all the power lines down, so there was a tremendous number of trees. And not only that, but one of the things, unless you've lived through a hurricane, you don't realize that whenever you have that level of destruction and when all the street signs are gone and all the power poles are gone and half the trees are missing, when you drive around town, you don't even know where you're at. So so GPS was working, but there was no cellular communication. So even staff driving around town trying to find patients home, the neighborhoods don't look the same anymore, and all the street signs are gone. And so that was definitely a very trying situation. And then a mandatory curfew. And this is probably one that broke our hearts more than anything, is that not only did it limit our ability to negotiate the roads, and it was not one of these situations where, hey, listen, we're a healthcare provider, because typically we can show our badge and we don't have to abide by the curfew. But due to the number of down power lines and trees, you could be driving down a road and literally run into a power line and not even know it. And so there was no movement at all out in the evenings. And then the other thing is that when our patients would pass away and families could finally get a message to us, we couldn't respond. And so they were actually having to stay in the home. overnight and sometimes for an extended period of time. You can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to show you just a few pictures to kind of get a mental picture of what we were dealing with. This was like this all over town. When I drove to get back to my house, I literally had to park in a commercial parking lot, trek 500 yards across a muddy field, go across a canal to get into my neighborhood because there was no way for a vehicle to get there. And so this is what our staff and our patients are having to deal with. And so just kind of getting a mental image as I'm kind of surveying the community, and I'm getting on a satellite phone and I'm talking to our CEO and talking about the state of the affairs. These are the things that we're seeing. You can go to the next slide. And then this is a tree in a good friend's yard. His house is completely destroyed. Obviously, it's impassable. So one of the things we're having to deal with now are not only with our patients that stayed, but this is what we're having to navigate to get to them to even provide care. You can go to the next slide. It's just a picture of when President Trump was visiting. We have chemical plants around us, and one of the things, because with no power and no emergency services, obviously the roads are blocked. And then when you go to the next slide, you're going to see driving on the interstate. I actually drove through that. It's a chlorine plant that's on fire. And so not only are we having to deal with the disaster, but now we're having to deal with a chemical release. And obviously with systems down and, you know, air quality, those kinds of things, it became a concern for even residents to return for a period of time. Just some more slides of the neighborhood. Just keep going. You know, the restaurant down the road. You can go to the next slide. This is actually one of our nurses' homes. The side of her house was completely tore out. There was no, you know, this is what our staff was coming home to try to figure out how to put their lives back together. And then the church down the street, you know, had some extensive damage. If any of you've ever been to Lake Charles, you know we have a big 22-story glass building. All the windows were blown out of it. And so just very, very traumatic. In fact, even to this day, it still hasn't been repaired. And so it's just kind of a constant reminder for us about the level of impact we've had. You can go to the next slide. So in the first 72 hours, how did we respond to this? Obviously, we're talking about a major emergency event. And now we're trying to put the pieces together. And so I really spent the day going throughout the community as best I could navigate it to try to put together. You know, you've got your disaster preparedness binder here with you, and you got all this patient information, you got all these things that you prepared for, and all of a sudden everything goes out the window because yes, this is a good information, but at the end of the day, we don't know what resources we have. Just kind of on a side note, one of the things that happened is when I was driving back into town, I was going over the bridge, my tire blew out, and for whatever reason, my spare tire was in my vehicle. So I had to hitchhike for someone to bring me 5 miles down the road, to crawl through a window, to take a family member's vehicle, to drive to the other side of town, navigate it, to get another vehicle just to be able to get past. So these are all the things that are going through my head right now, figuring out how do I provide care for 220 patients and I'm a resourceful guy. How am I going to provide care for them and follow this disaster preparedness plan when I can't even successfully get across town without a flat tire going there? How are my staff going to do this? And so what we did is within the first 72 hours, we reestablished communication with all 220 patients. It took an army to do this. We had corporate officers doing it. We had staff that was remote other places. You know, our plan together was, here's your list. Immediately start making phone calls, and we were starting to do assessments on where our staff was, but also our patients. They were spread across 5 states. Actually, it was about 7 or 8 states by the time it was all over with. And so now you're thinking, hey, listen, we prepared, and we're thinking within like a week's time, they're coming back. But now due to the level of devastation, we don't know when they're going to come back. So all of our decision-making now is based off of a lack of information on how to appropriately respond. But what we did know was there was patients still currently in our community that desperately needed care, that didn't have access to a hospital, that didn't have access to resources. And so now we were going to actually have to bring these resources to them. So we created a response team who could help coordinate care, establish a base of operation. My house was, half my roof was missing. So we just tarped the thing. We flew in an electrician, brought a generator in from out of state, basically band-aided my house. I sent my family away for 4 months and basically set up a base of operation because as much as the area was affected and the lack of resources, we understood in order to appropriately manage it and make sure that people were taken care of, we couldn't just constantly be driving in each day. We had to have a way to operate. And so they actually came in, we talked our house, and basically just went to work. We gathered a ton of resources from outside the community. You know, we'd already prepared for things like water and food. You know, we didn't think about things like scrubs or, you know, more DME, more supplies, those types of things. We had stockpiled them, but we were not fully prepared for what we were experiencing at that time. And so really we established a base of operation inside the affected area, and then we established another one outside, because at the end of the day, because communication was so spotty, I needed to make sure that someone had the ability. And so we actually put about 5 members of our management up at the University of Lafayette, Louisiana, in their student housing, put their families up in there, and worked out of one of our sister agencies, because obviously, you know, it's always nice to have help come in from the outside, but nobody knows your patients like you do. And so all of our patient care managers were able to be housed out of there. And we're really at this point in time going to work to make sure not only were the patients cared for inside, but also outside the affected area. You can go to the next slide. So now we've had the event, now things have happened. We've looked at our disaster preparedness plan. A lot of what we've put in place was relevant, but it was not going to be effective. So now we're having to figure out how in the world do I get. So now we're looking at not only patient care, but you're also looking at a large operation and a business that has to have resources. And so part of the preparedness was the social workers understanding, you know, what their role was in meeting those families' emotional needs as they experienced this with them. You know, not only were their houses damaged, but now these residents' houses were damaged. And so we built a network between them and our chief compliance officer, because at the end of the day, you know, as much as things kind of go out the window in the events of an emergency, as much grace and leeway as maybe the state or maybe the federal government or the local government may give you, at the end of the day, we wanted to make sure to remain compliant throughout this process, because we thought it was important that we not only make sure that people just don't act carelessly, but that we act in accordance with those areas of compliance. And so the social worker and our chief compliance officer actually worked together. They established over 100 traveling contracts in over a week's time. And so they were trying to make sure not only do we know where the resident was, but also contacting other hospice companies to help provide care, again, because we didn't know how long they were gone. Remote nurses were establishing relationships with these contracted hospices that were caring for their patients, because at the end of the day, though they may be on a travel contract for a period of time, it was still important that we document our contact with them daily. It was important that we got care plan updates. You know, we had patients that had to have face-to-faces done that week, and or other things that needed to be done. And so now we're having to make phone calls to, you know, the state and say, hey, listen, with COVID, there was some leeway in allowing, you know, virtual face-to-faces, but now we've got patients that are across state lines. What does that look like? And so we're having to communicate with the federal government, we're having to communicate with local government, the state, trying to make sure that we stay compliant in that. We had to purchase satellite phones. Like I said, our cell phone communication went down. And so we had limited communication. So we were having to bring satellite phones in, visit homes. Myself and my boss literally visit the home of every single employee to establish their level of need, from their homes to financial resources, that type of things, in order for us to put a plan together. We distributed DME and supplies to make sure that everybody had the appropriate supplies needed. And then we held meetings twice a day. If anything I can tell you throughout a disaster is that ongoing constant communication with measurable goals put in place. Because at the end of the day, everybody that's a part of this process is also affected. So we had to make sure that we were always on the same page, because we didn't want two people doing the same thing and overstepping each other. So we were constantly looking at our resources on hand. We were looking at the staff needs, what staff was available to see the patients, because we only had about 5 nurses to care for over 100 patients in a very difficult situation. Plus all the rest of them may or may not be able to come home because they have no home to go to. And then looking at, you know, managing a census. So not only you've got a census of your patients in town, you got a census of patients out of town, you got patients that have passed away that we're having to do that with. We're having to coordinate with other hospice companies. We have patients in areas that have no hospice provider willing to take them. So we're having to make sure that we're constantly communicating with that. You can go to the next slide. Unanticipated challenges. I'll tell you one thing that's not listed on here. Because of COVID, the state was not allowed to open up shelters. No shelters at all. So understand many of our resident or patients did not have the financial resources. Like they intended to evacuate, and the plan was go to a shelter, but the state only a few days beforehand made the comment, we're not going to open shelters due to COVID. So now where are they at? They're living in a car, and they're worried about, they're trying to find ways to hook up adapters into their vehicles, and they don't have fuel, and so those types of things. So COVID really brought a new level. You know, we had prepared for the event, but what we didn't think about was, like, we never thought that the state would ever make the comment, hey, no disaster shelters. And so, you know, obviously for those of you who've been a part of an affected area, you know, there's no housing for 100 miles or 200 miles. And so now many of our patients are having to manage that as well. We didn't know the level of damage was going to happen. You know, I've been through, I can't countless hurricanes in my lifetime. Only 3 times has it ever been to this level. So not understanding what the challenges were going to be, you can prepare as best you can, but you can't ever foresee the possible intended outcomes. Patients were moving locations literally every day. So they'd stay at a friend's house, and the friend would say, hey, listen, I can't have you stay here. I got family coming in. So they'd move again, and then they'd move again. So when I talked about traveling contracts, so one of the things we had was many of the hospices said, hey, listen, we're not going to put them on a traveling contract. In our conversation with them, I said, listen, they may come home tomorrow. They may come home next week. They may move from where they're at today 2 days from now. And so we can only transfer them once in a cert period. So please give us some leeway, because understand we're managing this from an affected area, trying to make sure our patients are taken care of. And we understand how difficult it is from a communication standpoint, especially with things like EMRs and not being able to put traveling patients in there. Can you help us out there? So some would allow us to do traveling contracts for a period of time, and then some of them wouldn't. And then the other thing was, even the ones that wouldn't necessarily be agreeable to providing DME. And we know how important things like oxygen concentrators, hospital beds, those types of things were needed. So now we're having to establish out-of-state contracts where residents were going that we did not have agencies in to provide DME, and imagine trying to do that and then not knowing whether they're going to stay there for any period of time. And so there were times where our DME provider was driving 200 and 300 miles out of state to go bring oxygen concentrators to our patients in another community, just because they want to make sure they're taken care of. The chief compliance officer had to stay in constant contact with the state, because again, though there were some COVID waivers in place, understand that there were patients in other states and maybe rural areas that didn't have hospices. So how can we legally provide care for a nurse who doesn't have a compact license? And now we're having to deal with doctors and pharmacies across state lines dealing with things like narcotics. And so she had to be in constant communication, and we were kind of seeing the situation evolve. And then the number of staff members, I think we probably had 8 staff members that literally had no home, like it was gone. And dealing with the emotional turmoil of that, and at the same time going like, how am I going to care for these patients? What am we going to do with them? And so that was definitely a very, very trying time. And even the ones that had homes left, many of their roofs were gone. They didn't have clothes anymore. They only left with a week's worth of clothes, and now they don't have a place to wash them, that kind of stuff. And so that was why it was important for us to set up a base of operation in the affected area, was that my home literally had a washer and dryer going 24 hours a day. They'd bring in their laundry, we'd wash it for them, we'd make sure they were good and fed, we would supply them with fuel that was being brought up in the community, and make sure they had everything in. And then the last thing is, and I never even thought about this honestly, most people and almost every other agency in town said, we're not going to admit any new patients. But understand there were patients who our hospitals, 1 week into the situation, shut down all the hospitals completely because they had no water. So now there are no emergency services, and EMS is moving people all over state or out of state. So everybody's being diverted. So no one ever thought to ask, what happens when somebody is in need in the affected area? So we as a company, as an agency, said, listen, we understand that it's going to create more challenges and more heartache, if you will, but somebody has to take care of these people. So 2 days after the hurricane, there's no power, there's no water, there's no food, there's no gas. Everything is having to be brought in from outside. It can only come during the day because nobody can drive at night. Where are we going to get medications? The pharmacy, it took them a week and a half to get back online. So we just said, we'll do the best we can because these people deserve care. So we started admitting patients 2 days after the storm. And, obviously now we have 120 patients who are on traveling contracts. We still have 100 in the affected area. They don't know whether they're going to afford it or they're going to stay or not. So we're having to constantly stay in that. And now we're adding more patients on top of it as well. So you can go to the next slide.
Brian, real quick, I know we're getting to lessons learned, and this is great. And we're looking forward to the lessons learned at this point, keeping in mind time as well and ensuring our participants have time to ask questions. As we move through lessons learned, please feel free to put your questions or thoughts, comments in the chat, and we will get to those questions right after this slide.
Absolutely. And I'll kind of go through this pretty quickly. More education for staff. One of the things that is many times as you talk to a patient's family, they think when the emergency happens, they're going to call hospice and say, come pick me up. Can you take me somewhere? Making sure that they have more education, understand their roles and responsibilities. One of the things we had to talk with the social workers about is, hey, listen, Medicare doesn't reimburse for the transportation, and we can't pay to transport everybody out of state, So make sure that they're fully aware that if they choose to stay, it's on them, and they're going to have to pay and be prepared to pay for transportation. A better explanation to patients and families about what it means to be on an at-risk registry. It's something I think we use nationwide, but people, have this thing in their mind that, when the emergency comes, that means somebody's going to show up to my door and pick me up. And that's not how it works. And so just having more education with that. Establishing relationships with providers outside of state if you're not a part of a larger organization. We wish we could have had to say, hey, listen, everybody go to Houston. We've got a hospice provider over there. They're going to take care of you. We work well together, and just having a larger network. In the events of a communication disruption, one of the things that we dealt with was employees were downloading apps to talk over like a radio. But the thing is, they're not HIPAA compliant. They can be monitored by the people. And we're having to say, hey, you can't use this. We can't talk about patient information over there. So obviously, you can't buy a satellite phone for everyone, but there are other ways of communicating that are HIPAA compliant, making sure that those things are part of your disaster preparedness. Our emergency preparedness focused primarily on how the agency would respond, but it didn't talk about how the organization would respond. So they were communicating with us, they were working through the process, but it would have been, because our staff was in the affected area, it would have been better had we had resources from the outside to have staff already trained and prepared to deal with the disaster to come in and alleviate them. And we did have staff from some of the other agencies offer to come in and see patients for a day or two, that sort of thing. But as an organization as a whole, understanding that we kind of row in the same direction and making sure that. And the last thing is that policies and procedures. Everybody doesn't want to say words like, hey, listen, I understand that your home's damaged. The company wants to pay you for as long as they can, but there's going to come a time that you either have to return to work or you're just not going to receive the paycheck. Having those things clearly lined out in policies that talked about when a disaster happens, what happens from an HR perspective. Does that mean the company's going to pay you for a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, a week, a month? Are you going to get some sort of financial incentive to come back? Are you going to get disaster pay? There are all these HR questions that were happening all of a sudden. We were trying to deal with the destruction of our own homes, but making sure our staff was taken care of. And so making sure that part of the policies and procedures is the HR's response to when the disaster happens, and it clearly lined out so that we're not having to respond to those things at the last minute. So you can go to the last one. And the last thing is that's a month afterwards. A week later, we get hit by Hurricane Delta. So we were putting our lives back together, and it was just the team that worked out of my house during that period of time. Just tremendous women of great faith and just hardworking, literally left their families in other states to come back to take care of our residents or our patients. And we were so thankful for their hard work and dedication. So I just want to show you the team. So that's it.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with us. And, when you said a month later, Hurricane Delta hit, the question that came to mind was lessons learned. These debriefs are so important because they help us in sort of an iterative way. Okay, the next time, how do we become a better version of ourselves? What did we miss this time? So would love to hear a little bit Brian, opening the floor to participants as well. And Brian, what are your thoughts? As you and your organization have clearly excelled through these disasters and have been prepared every single time, these lessons learned, have they helped, address the next situation, the next disaster a little bit in a more prepared way?
Absolutely. Just last year, it was last year, the year before, the Hurricane Ida hit the New Orleans area. We were able to take everything that we learned from there and everything we created and to hand it to a new agency and to be a part of that. And obviously, when you go through an experience like that, your first response when somebody else is going through it is, hey, I know I've been there to help you out with it and to have some resources. I think one of the things that we don't do a great job at is when people are in the middle of it, we're trying to manage the situation, but we tend not to help to manage the person and their emotional energy and making sure that that's well managed as well.
Rightly said. Thank you. Well said. Do we have any questions, any comments, any thoughts from the audience? Rory.
I have to say, thank you, Brian, for that presentation. That's absolutely amazing. And it makes me want to go dig up all of our own NHPCO resources to figure out where we have gaps that we can steal ideas from you. But one thing that it also struck me was your comment about how patients, if they died, had to be left in the home. And so I was thinking, again, not just managing the emotional feelings of the staff, but how to help them talk to patients and families about what to expect if they had to stay in the home. And, if that was even a conversation to, depending on where they were sort of in their, if they were actively dying or sort of further upstream, or maybe the stress of it, but thinking that that's something that when you're preparing your families for, managing a disaster, it's not just you might run out of, water or, electricity or whatever, but if this happens, what is your plan? And just sort of thinking about the anticipatory grief of what that might be. So I'm just thinking again, and it's not really so much a question, it's just oh my gosh, how would we support our staff to talk to patients and families about that and to help families be prepared for something like that? So thank you for sharing that aspect of your experience.
Thanks, Rory. Leslie Foster, you have your hand up.
Hi, so we're just right next door to Brian. We're in Houston, and it was interesting when Hurricane Laura was making its way to landfall. There was a moment where we weren't exactly sure if it was going to go to the east or the west. And so we, as a hospice agency, were also doing our emergency preparedness. We also ended up having dozens and dozens of patients that came on our services from the Lake Charles area. Some of them ended up staying here, and some of them, were able to return home. But we were, very happy that so many agencies were working so diligently to get those traveling contracts and stuff together so that we could accommodate their needs. I know that for here in Houston, one of the things that we do is we make sure that we have a paper emergency binder, and it has we do their priority levels. We have at least 3 or 4 different contacts for them, and then we also have a hard copy of their case sheets. Our social workers are required to take it to every IDT meeting and update it accordingly. One of the things that I really try to work with our new social workers when I'm doing orientation on is to really train them on the importance of establishing and talking about these evacuation plans upon their initial assessments. And they change, so it's just really important to keep fluid with it and if they're in respite, to change that information to make sure that we know where our patients are at all times. So Brian, that was an incredible presentation, and I learned so much from that. I was diligently taking notes on some things that I want to make sure that that I take back to our agency. I also just want to say that, I think sometimes, especially down here in the South, we think it's focused on just hurricanes. Houston had to prepare for the freeze that we had a couple of years ago. And so it was kind of a similar situation, with weather conditions that we aren't usually accustomed to. So that was really great information. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Sarah, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think I'm really just dittoing what other people have said. That was such a good presentation. I'm really impressed. And as we're in North Carolina, I'm in with Transitions Life Care in Durham and Raleigh. And, hurricanes come our way in North Carolina, but I'm thinking about family I have in Montana and Oregon that talked to us about fires that come their way and the 5 feet of snow in Buffalo and the flooding of the Mississippi, and just how relevant this topic is across the country. And I really think the information was so valuable and applies to so many different situations. And the example of a hurricane is relevant, but it's really nationally relevant. And it was really, really great to hear, even though it was a tragedy. Such a great learning experience.
Thank you, Sarah. Shannon?
Well, I just want to say, as I'm sure everybody thinks on this call, Brian, you are an absolute rock star. You, having been through this situation so many times on our coast as well, I think in the last 5 years since I've been doing this, we've activated our emergency plan at least 7 or 8 times. And so I just wanted to, add to just a couple things you said. The first one was, each time you do this and you do those post drills where you're really looking at things that went well, things that didn't go well, I think that is the most valuable piece of this entire process. The state, I'm not sure everybody's state regs, but, federally, we have to have a plan. Statewide, we have to have a plan. But that organization-based emergency preparedness manual, the thing that you put together that you say, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, this is who's doing what, this is how we're going to move our resources, those things, and then updating those every time that you have some sort of an emergency, I have found to be the most helpful. And I think for people that don't do this all the time, that don't have hurricanes all the time, that putting together something for your organization, not just policies, but things related to specifically who does what when, I think is really helpful.
Thank you, Shannon. Eric.
Thanks. And so Brian, just phenomenal presentation, and God bless all you for the work that you guys did during that crisis. It's just, this is a hugely applicable topic. And I think to dovetail on some of the things Shannon said, just looking at your emergency response task force or committee on a regular basis and who should be on there. One of the things that's really helped us out through COVID and some other crises are volunteers. And then the other piece is, I think this is applicable even to things like active shooter, or when you have a violent situation on your campus, which unfortunately we've encountered several times. Just something else to think about that I think falls in line with the whole emergency preparedness. But again, phenomenal presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And, we close out the session with this last comment from Karen. I'm reading in the chat, Brian, what was striking to me was the care you provided to your team. And what struck me, I totally agree, Karen, what struck me was the comment you made, Brian, that we've got to take care of the people who are taking care of people. We've got to take care of their energy and make sure that they continue to have the capability of taking care of others. So thank you for addressing that as well. We often get so busy in doing what we need to do that we forget to take care of the people who are, doing that work. Thank you, everybody, for your time here today. We, look forward to our next ECHO session, which will be in January of 2023. Of course, great information today, great knowledge, great learning, and we'll be sending sort of some high points here as well from lessons learned. What is next for Project ECHO, for NHPCO sponsored Project ECHO? This was our last session of the year. Join us in 2023 for the NHPCO Project ECHO DEI curriculum. And we'll be looking at DEI curriculum equity where it matters. We know that CMS has designated DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, to be the first strategic pillar for their framework. And as we think about the work around equity and access that is being done in healthcare, we always want to focus on outcomes and making sure that the work that we're doing is getting to where it really matters. We look forward to these sessions. These will be held twice a month, and more details will be coming out soon within the next few weeks. At this point, please access our Project ECHO webpage. This is the link. This PowerPoint will be available shortly. Please do not forget to fill in the session evaluation. We look forward to hearing your feedback. Your feedback helps us improve the sessions here. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the day and have a wonderful holiday.